Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ryan Gelman. I am the Project Director for Public Policy and Advocacy at the National Community Action Partnership. And I'm joined here by Leslie Barnes, who's Senior Counsel at Alliance for Justice. And we're here today to talk about some advocacy and lobbying rules surrounding fair districting efforts going on around the country. As many of you probably know, the National Partnership received some funding to do some outreach on fair districting campaigns around the country. As part of that initiative, we are providing resources in partnership with Boulder Advocacy here so that folks can be more familiar with the advocacy and lobbying rules surrounding fair districting practices. I'm sure that Leslie's going to get into it a little bit more, but as many of you know, the redistricting around the country is in full swing right now. I think half or maybe more than half of the states have finalized maps, but it doesn't just have to do with members of Congress and funding. It also has to do with local school boards, county level. So these are things that I think a lot of community action agencies have a stake in. So it's just important for everyone to be aware of the processes going on in their states. So that's why we're here today, to learn a little bit more about how and when to get involved. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Leslie Barnes. I will be monitoring the chat. And this is also being recorded, and we're going to send the slides out afterwards. And if you have a question or anything, just put them in the chat. We'll try to answer them as we go along, or I can answer in the chat as well. That's it. So I'll hand it over to Leslie, and thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ryan, so much for setting this up, and to Jim also for joining us on the pre-planning call. We are excited to be here. At Alliance for Justice, we are a 501c3 organization that has two primary programs, and we are a membership organization. So half of my colleagues spend their time working on a justice initiative, working around judicial nominees. And then the other half of my colleagues, we spend in our Boulder Advocacy program, helping to support nonprofits in their advocacy work, helping them understand which advocacy activities amount to lobbying and which advocacy activities amount to election year activity. And depending upon the organization's tax exempt status, which of those election year activities are permissible and impermissible, and how to help comply and make their advocacy as impactful as possible. So I hope today is just the beginning of a conversation. We have a hotline that is free for all nonprofits, so they can reach out to any one of our evaluation experts or attorneys. And while we cannot be your attorney, we can help answer the lobbying and election year questions that your nonprofit may have to help narrow down those questions you need to refer to outside counsel. So some of the types of questions we can answer both today and on the hotline is whether your grant allows your organization to engage in lobbying. So when you're trying to create a budget and determine whether you have funding for lobbying, which is one type of advocacy activities, we can help determine if you have funding for those type of advocacy activities. We could look at your Twitter post or a sign-on letter and help you determine if that activity or communication is a lobbying communication. We can also help determine if you can join together in coalition and share a message with your network. So in today's agenda, when I worked with Jim and Ryan, we wanted to kind of hit on several points around both state and congressional redistricting, and then this year's redistricting, which will be municipal, city, town, and school board redistricting. So we wanted to highlight the fact that nonprofits, almost all nonprofits, can lobby. They can influence the redistricting process. We'll talk about which one of those redistricting and advocacy activities amounts to lobbying and how you track it and who you report it to. We'll talk about some tips to maximize your advocacy and where to go to get help with those advocacy questions. So we'll jump right in. If you would like to drop into the chat, I would love to get an idea for how many organizations have engaged in some of the advocacy activities, of which there are many. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, How many of you out there have engaged in a Know Your Rights event? Have you ever held an event where you've helped community members understand what their rights are? Maybe around the child care tax credit? How many of you have surveyed community members to understand what their priorities are? Or have you helped elevate a community member's story to elected officials? Maybe a legislator, maybe a governor, maybe a mayor, or a school board member. How many of you have organized a lobby day at your state capitol or on Capitol Hill? How many of you have participated in either a virtual or an in-person lobby day, or maybe even conducted a candidate forum? These are all types of advocacy activities. And as nonprofits, you are trusted messengers in your community. And so rather than cede the microphone to elected officials or to folks that may not have your community's best interest at heart, it is well within your organization's right as a nonprofit to engage in these types of advocacy activities. When we're talking about advocacy, there's not really a legal definition for it, but it's a variety of activities that tend to support or oppose an issue that creates lasting systemic change. There's all types of advocacy, both personal advocacy within our families and our communities. There's professional advocacy, where we might advocate to our boss for a raise or promotion. But when we're talking about advocacy in this context, we're talking about community and public policy advocacy, that type of work and communication that creates lasting system change. And working on redistricting definitely falls within the definition of public policy advocacy. Within all of the different types of advocacy activities, there's one type of activity that it does have a legal definition for IRS purposes, for nonprofits out there, and that's called lobbying. And so the IRS is concerned about how much lobbying certain types of nonprofits engage in. And so we're going to talk today about the IRS definition of lobbying, and then we'll talk a little bit about the state's definition of lobbying too. They overlap a little bit. So for the IRS and for your grant purposes generally, lobbying means trying to influence the legislative process, legislation. So that includes the budget, that includes ballot measures that the public vote on, such as constitutional amendments or those yes/no questions on the ballot rather than candidate questions. So we'll look at kind of the nuances of when does redistricting work amount to lobbying? Because let's face it, redistricting is different in every state. Some states have an independent redistricting commission, and they act unilaterally without any oversight from the legislative body. Some redistricting commissions take the first draw at the map, but they still require legislative stamp of approval. And then in some states, like the state where I'm from in Indiana, the legislative maps are drawn only by the legislative body. And so what we're talking about today is when you're influencing those maps, your activities, whether they amount to lobbying or not, are going to be different in every state, depending upon your state's redistricting process. But there's a way to tell whether or not your activities amount to lobbying. A couple of rules you need to know is when you are trying to influence legislation, you are engaged in lobbying. Lobbying requires unrestricted funding. And so even for those of you that are not involved in creating your organization's budget, you do need to know, and you need to ask your executive director whether your organization has funds that allow you to lobby. So government grants cannot be used for lobbying. Both federal, generally state and local government grants, and government contracts cannot be used for lobbying. So if your organization is 100% funded by government grants and contracts, you need to keep your advocacy activities on the non-lobbying side of the equation. But that doesn't mean you can't do any advocacy. It just means you need to keep your advocacy on the non-lobbying side of the equation. For those of you who do have unrestricted funds that allow you to engage in lobbying, you need to track that lobbying for a couple different reasons, because you need to report to your funders when you have engaged in lobbying. Sorry. You also need to report to the IRS when you have engaged in lobbying at the end of the year. Nonprofits file what's called a 990 information return. It's like our tax returns that we file as individuals. And it's called an information return, a Form 990. They're available to the public, and you can see your organization's 990. As a matter of fact, we have a resource on it called Give Me Your 990 that talks about how your organization can comply with public records requests to disclose financial information and programmatic activities. So lobbying has to be reported to the IRS at the end of each year, has to be reported to the funders at the end of each grant reporting period, and oftentimes you have to report your lobbying to the state lobbying officials. And in each state, it's a little bit different. That may be to your Secretary of State, that may be to your State Ethics Commission, or the State Elections Division, the State Lieutenant Governor. Every state has a little bit different enforcement body. And then if you are in a state which is fortunate enough to have an independent redistricting commission that can draw the legislative maps without any legislative oversight, then your activity to those redistricting commissions does not amount to lobbying at all. And then don't forget, this year in 2022, a lot of states and local units of government are involved in what's called municipal redistricting. So while Ryan said almost all of the states have either completed or are almost finished with congressional and state redistricting, and they're getting ready to implement those maps. So there's still a lot of advocacy to be done. It's just around either enacted legislation, enacted bills, or challenging the legislation. But there's still a lot of advocacy around municipal redistricting as well. And so so a lot of the advocacy is on a continuum. So if you look kind of on the left side of this timeline, I guess I made, when you're researching the redistricting process and you're learning about how your state redistricts or how your local unit of government conducts the redistricting, researching the process, understanding the process, even learning about how to use the redistricting software, probably not lobbying. If you're learning about communities of interest and you're gathering information about how the current maps affect your community, the current maps, not lobbying, because you're talking about current law. But once you begin to engage in how the new maps should look, if it involves legislation, then you're beginning to get into the area where you may need to track your advocacy as lobbying. And we'll talk about how you know whether that type of advocacy amounts to direct or grassroots lobbying, or maybe just straight up lobbying. And then once the redistricting maps become enacted and your community is helping to implement those maps or challenge those maps, and you're working on an enacted bill or public law, then that advocacy, once you're over the hurdle and the legislation is enacted, the advocacy afterwards also is not lobbying. So there's just kind of this one area when you are involved in influencing legislation that may amount to lobby. A lot of the pre-work and the post-work will not amount to lobbying. So before we jump into kind of the nuances and look at examples today, wanted to remind folks, because I know folks here are a variety of tax exempt entities. The majority of you are what's called 501c3 public charities, because that's the majority of nonprofits that exist today. So if you are a 501c3 public charity, if you work or volunteer for one, wanted you to know that your organization is tax exempt, first of all. All of these organizations are tax exempt that you see across this chart. Tax exempt means that the contributions they receive are exempt from federal income taxes. So none of these organizations up here on the screen pay federal income taxes, generally speaking, unless they earn some type of income that is not related to their charitable mission, I should add, because there are quite a few CAP organizations that do earn income that is related to their charitable mission. That doesn't generate income taxes either. As a matter of fact, fee for services can be a really good funding stream for public charities to fund their lobbying activities. But one of the really cool features of public charities is because they are federally supported by tax dollars, they are able to award their donors a charitable tax deduction. Only if those donors itemize their tax deductions, their personal tax deductions. And in 2017, Congress raised the standard deduction on yours and mine individual income tax returns. And so a lot of us don't itemize our personal income taxes anymore when we pay federal income taxes. And so we're not able to take a charitable income tax deduction for our donations to our charities, our faith organizations anymore. But for those individuals for whom they do still itemize their taxes, they are able to receive a deduction, a charitable deduction, when they donate to a public charity. However, because public charities receive tax subsidies, Congress made the decision that public charities should not engage in a lot of lobbying. But that does mean public charities can engage in a limited amount of lobbying. That's why you have to track your lobbying so you don't exceed your lobbying limit. Public charities that go beyond an insubstantial amount of lobbying can lose their tax exempt status. It means they can lose their right to exist, lose their right to receive grants, and their officers could be assessed fines, the organization could be assessed fines. So it's really important to track your lobbying and to keep the lobbying an insubstantial amount of your activities if you work or volunteer for a public charity. The other type of activity that public charities need to be aware of is in red, is that public charities cannot support or oppose candidates running for elected office. And so sometimes when you are engaged with legislators in an election year, you need to be really careful that your advocacy does not appear to be supporting or opposing those elected officials, especially if they've announced they're running for office. That's where Boulder Advocacy can come in handy. We can help you ensure that your advocacy activities don't cross the line into supporting or opposing those elected officials that may be also candidates. In the middle of the column, if you work or volunteer for a 501c4, those are called social welfare organizations or advocacy organizations. And as you see in green, they can engage in an unlimited amount of lobbying. They're still tax exempt, but they cannot give their donors a charitable tax deduction. This is kind of this mid-level tax treatment. And because of that, you see in yellow at the bottom of the screen, these C4 and C5 organizations, which by the way, C5s are labor organizations and C6 are trade associations, and they all share the same characteristics. That's why they're grouped together. So not only can these types of nonprofits in the middle column engage in an unlimited amount of lobbying, but they can support and oppose candidates. They can endorse candidates. And so that's why sometimes you'll see the NAACP or CAP Action or the ACLU or the Sierra Club, which are all C4s, they'll sometimes endorse candidates for elected office. And then on the far right-hand side of the column, you've got your political organizations. These are your candidate campaigns, your PACs, your state parties, your national Democratic parties, your national Republican parties, your Libertarian parties. These organizations exist primarily to get candidates elected, but they're tax exempt entities too. There's about 30 different types of tax exempt entities. And what you don't see on this chart are private foundations. They too are 501c3s, but they're to the left of this chart and they cannot engage in lobbying, but they can fund and award grants to your organizations that do engage in lobbying. And there's a way that private foundation funds can legally be used for lobbying. We have a ton of resources. It's outside the scope of this webinar, but we do have resources available for free, and we can provide additional workshops that talk about how to know how to apply for those types of private foundation grants that can support your lobbying advocacy activities. This chart just kind of restates the prior slide. So all the advocacy activities in green are activities your C3 can engage in with restricted grant funding. The funding that in your grant agreement says your activities cannot, these grants cannot be used for lobbying. You can use them for all of the green activities. Those are non-lobbying activities. And as long as you keep them nonpartisan, you're not using them to support or oppose a candidate for elected office, you can use those restricted grant funds. Not government funds, but private foundation grant funding for the green activities. So in this webinar today, we're going to look at some redistricting activities, and we're going to determine whether the redistricting activities amount to lobbying, non-lobbying, or an exception to lobbying for which you could use restricted grant funding. And so I've dropped in some examples here. As well, I've provided some links to 3 different types of C3 permissible, some C3 permissible redistricting activities that took place in Michigan early last year in 2021 that did amount to lobbying. These were 3 different communities that made arguments to the Michigan legislature to try to shape and influence the Michigan congressional and House and Senate maps. And so you can take a look at those when we send around the slides tomorrow. So when we talk about lobbying, know that lobbying is a definition that depends upon the context of how you're using the term. Just like a lot of different terms depend upon the context. And I sometimes think it helps to think of a term that we're all familiar with. If you're talking about whether someone is a minor or an adult, that definitely depends upon the context. In the state where I'm from, Indiana, I probably should stop saying that now that I've been a Maryland resident for 2 years, but I lived in Indiana for over 30 years and I know Indiana law really, really well. So I'll use Indiana law as an example. In Indiana, for school attendance, children have to attend school until the mandatory age of 16. So at 16, Hoosiers are considered to be an adult for the purpose of withdrawing from school. Driving purposes, same thing. In Indiana, at 16, you can apply for your learner's permit. I've been away long enough, but at 17, it used to be you could apply for your driver's license in Indiana. Purchasing cigarettes, you had to be 19 in Indiana. You were considered an adult for purchasing cigarettes in Indiana. For voting purposes, you had to be 21 in Indiana. For voting, you had to be 18. For purchasing alcohol, you had to be 21. And so Indiana had multiple different definitions for when somebody became an adult. Same with lobbying. And so we're going to talk about 2 primary definitions of lobbying. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the definition of lobbying as it applies for your tax-exempt status. So that's the IRS's definition of lobbying. That's also the grant, your private foundation and your community foundation grant definition of lobbying. It's not the government grant definition of lobbying, but it is the same definition for your private foundation and your community foundation grants. And then we'll talk a little bit about the state definition of lobbying, but know that there are several different other definitions of lobbying out there. So when people talk about lobbying, make sure that you ask them what context they're talking about lobbying in. So for your organization's tax-exempt status, for their ability to exist and receive tax-deductible charitable donations, lobbying's limited. So let's look at some examples of not lobbying, first of all, then we'll look at some examples of lobbying. Then we'll dive into the definitions. So if you were to share your story or a community member's story with a legislator about how the current laws affect your family or your community, that's not lobbying. You're talking about a current law and how it impacts your community, not lobbying. Second bullet point, if you were to share with the public why fair maps are important, not lobbying, generally speaking. Or if you were to share a nonpartisan analysis of the maps, let's say the legislature has taken its first draft of the maps, or your redistricting commission has published its first draft of the maps, and your organization has conducted an analysis of the maps, and you share that analysis broadly on the website with the public, and your analysis is such that it provides multiple perspectives so that people could fact check your work, then the IRS says that type of nonpartisan analysis is not lobbying. We have a resource on that. Likewise, if you were to provide feedback on legislative maps in states where the maps are not legislatively approved, in other words, where you have an independent redistricting commission that is free from any legislative oversight, providing feedback or commenting on those types of maps, not lobbying. Let's flip over to the other side. Look at some lobbying examples, which you can do as a public charity. If you were to prepare to testify about legislatively drawn maps, know that all your preparation going into that testimony is lobbying, because the IRS says preparing to lobby is lobbying. If you were to express support or opposition for legislatively drawn maps, that's lobbying. You can do it, just track it, make sure you have unrestricted funding. Or if you were to encourage the public to support or oppose legislatively drawn maps, that's lobbying too. So how much lobbying can your public charity do if you're a C3? There's two different tests. First, I'll stop and see if we've got any questions so far, Ryan.
Thanks, Leslie. There's no questions in the chat. It's a lot of information, so I know people, it just takes a minute, but I would just continue, and then if things start to pop up, I'll definitely let you know.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So C3 public charities actually have two different ways to determine and tell the IRS. Let me start again. C3 public charities have two different ways to conduct and track their lobbying. It's up to the public charity how much lobbying they want to engage in, but they have to tell the IRS. So the first way is kind of a default mechanism. When your organization was created, a lot of C3 public charities don't engage in a lot of advocacy. And so this default mechanism is what the IRS calls an insubstantial part test. And this is what the majority of public charities fall in. You don't have to take any extra action. So all public charities, unless they've done or taken any extra action, fall within this insubstantial part test. And what this means is that your organization can conduct between 3 to 5% of all of their activities and expenditures can be spent on lobbying. So it's kind of an activities and an expenditure test combined. It's pretty small, 3 to 5% of all your activities and your expenses can be spent on lobbying. The IRS doesn't give us a very clear-cut definition of what amounts to lobbying. They also don't give us a very definitive cutoff point of how much lobbying is too much. And remember, if you go past that point of too much, you jeopardize your organization's ability to exist, and you place your organization in risk of of incurring financial penalties, and your officers could personally incur financial penalties. So if your organization is going to be doing very much lobbying at all, there's an alternative. And this public charities can elect to take what's called the 501h election. It makes them an electing public charity. Does not change their tax exempt status. They're still 501c3 public charities. Simply means they file a simple form with the IRS. It's 2 questions, really simple form. But they tell the IRS that, hey, we're going to track our lobbying expenditures. And at the end of each year, we will tell you how much money we spent on lobbying. And now you can spend up to 20% of your budget on lobbying. But it's a sliding scale. So it's not 20% of all your budget. It's 20% of your first $500,000 of your annual budget. And then it's a sliding scale. The next 500,000 is 15%. We have a calculator on our website, free to use. So you can plug in your annual exempt expenditure budget. We can tell you how much direct lobbying you can do, how much grassroots lobbying you can do. So let's take a look of why this matters. Here's an example here from Fair Districts, PA. They've retweeted a post from the Public Interest Law Center, a 501c3 public charity that is an electing public charity. They've taken the H election. But let's assume this is any 501c3 public charity out there. Let's look at the tweet. This says, read our proposed map. Our plan moves Pennsylvania past prison gerrymandering, preserves communities of interest, and was developed using neutral, nonpartisan principles without regard for advantages to parties or incumbents. And then it links to their draft map, congressional and state House and Senate maps. So this group, Public Interest Law Center, has drawn state and congressional election maps and is proposing them to the public. This type of advocacy and creating these maps is going to be lobbying for some groups and not lobbying for other groups, depending upon the way your public charity tracks its lobbying. And this is super strategic. It allows your organization to conduct a lot more advocacy with restricted funding if you take the 501h election. So let's take a look at the definitions of lobbying for each type of public charity. If you're a non-electing public charity, which most of you are, unless you've taken this 501h election. So for non-electing public charities, your definition of lobbying is contained in these 3 bullet points. It's any communication to lawmakers to influence legislation. It's any communication that encourages the public to contact their lawmakers to influence legislation. And it's any public advocacy in support or opposition of legislation. And that's what Public Interest Law Center has done. They have engaged in advocacy supporting legislation. They've said, here are our maps. These maps are good for Pennsylvania. So it is public advocacy in support of legislation. And if Public Interest Law Center was a non-electing public charity, all of the work that went into creating these maps would amount to lobbying. However, they are an electing public charity. They've taken the 501h election. And if you look over on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see there's only 2 definitions of lobbying. One is direct communication to lawmakers, expressing an opinion on legislation. And the other type of lobbying is a communication with the public, expressing a view about legislation with a call to action. And we'll get into what a call to action is. But I can tell you, all this work and this tweet does not contain a call to action. It is simply public advocacy for legislation. So for non-electing public charities, creating a map and sharing it with the public is lobbying. Got it? So I'll say it again, for non-electing public charities, creating a map, a sample map, and sharing it with the public is lobbying. You can do it, but you have to have unrestricted funding, and it's going to take a lot of time and expense, staff time, to create a sample map, whether it's a congressional map, a state house map, a municipal map. So you can do it, you just need the funding. If you're going to do something like that, you might be better off taking this 501H election, becoming an electing public charity. This will apply to all your advocacy, because supporting or opposing legislation publicly without a call to action is not lobbying. What this means for you strategically is now all of your grants that you've received from private foundations and community foundations that have that little clause in there that says these grants cannot be used for lobbying, guess what? You can use those grants for this type of work because it's not lobbying anymore. This is usually where we generate some questions. But we will send out these slides so that you can have them and kind of look it over. I know this a little bit mind-blowing, but this is one of the tips that public charities can do. It only takes a few minutes to file this form with the IRS. It is 2 questions long. It is your organization's name and date. Once you take the 501H election, it is retroactive to the beginning of your tax year, and the election continues year after year until your organization revokes it. You can look on your organization's 990 Schedule C to see if your organization has taken the 501H election in the past. You also could ask your accountant or your bookkeeper if your organization has taken the 501H election. You also could file a request with the IRS to ask to see a copy of the form. That takes about 6 weeks. But there's a number of ways you can determine whether or not you've taken this 501H election, but it gives your organization the ability to engage in a lot of advocacy activities with restricted grant funding. It's easier to report to the IRS. It does not subject you to any greater degree of audits. So tip number 1, consider taking the 501H election to maximize your advocacy. So let's dive into kind of the definitions of direct and grassroots lobbying. Both definitions involve a communication. And the IRS has said a communication is any method of transferring information from one person to the other. Communication can be in writing, in person, or online. It can be a TikTok post, an Instagram post, or a letter. Legislators are found at every level of government, federal, state, and local. Even voters who are voting on a ballot measure stand in the place of legislators. Sometimes elected executives stand in the place of legislators when they're formulating legislation. This usually happens when executives are either crafting their budget or determining whether to support or veto legislation. So if you're talking to the president or the mayor and asking them to veto legislation, you're engaged in lobbying. But there's a lot of policymakers that impact policy that has the force and effect of law, and you can advocate to them. And advocating to them does not amount to lobbying because they just are not considered legislators for IRS purposes. And as you'll see, bullet point number 3, independent redistricting commissions that have the discretion to act without any legislative approval are not legislators. So your advocacy to them does not amount to lobbying. Let's take a look at the 3rd element of direct lobbying. So we talked about communication to a legislator, which by the way includes their staff or surrogates. Then the 3rd element is expressing a view on specific legislation. So specific legislation applies not only to legislation that's been introduced, but it also applies to a specific policy proposal. And the IRS has said specific policy proposals are when you have identified a problem and a solution that can only be fixed by legislation. So sometimes there's a variety of solutions to the problem. And if you identify a problem that has a variety of solutions and you're talking to a legislator about it, you're not necessarily involved in lobbying. But if you're talking to a legislator about redistricting, and the only way to solve that problem is through legislation, then you are engaged in lobbying, and you need to track that activity and all the preparation time that went into preparing for that communication. There's lots of different types of policy, regulations, executive orders that have the force and effect of law, but for IRS purposes, just simply don't amount to legislation. And one of those that's occurring right now is a lot of litigation around redistricting. We're seeing that in a lot of different states. So your C3 could join in the litigation, could comment on the litigation, could file amicus briefs, which are friend of the court briefs. And that communication and advocacy is not going to amount to lobbying. That means you can use restricted grant funding, not government funding, but if you had some private foundation or community foundation grants that could not be used for lobbying, you can speak up on litigation, legal challenges to the redistricting maps. How about thanking elected officials? Sometimes thanking an elected official is going to amount to lobbying. If you're in the middle of session, then it looks like when you thank a legislator for introducing or hearing a bill, you're attempting to influence legislation. So you need to track that activity accordingly. After session has passed and the bill can no longer be resurrected, thanking an elected official does not amount to lobbying. However, if you thank an elected official close enough to an election, and your attempt is to influence the outcome of a legislation or the outcome of an election, it may cross over into that territory of partisan, impermissible activity for 501c3s. So if you're not sure, give us a call. We can help. That's what our hotline is for. So let's look at this example and try to determine if this is direct lobbying. If your C3 signed on to this letter to a group of Missouri legislators saying we need a map that reflects that Missouri voters are pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and pro-God, the US Supreme Court allows maximum political gerrymandering, and we ask that you use that power, is that direct lobbying? Is that a communication to legislators expressing a view on legislation? That's an example of direct lobbying. You can do it, just track it, make sure you have the funding for it. If you were to support the repeal of a law, know that that's lobbying. However, if you were to comment on current law, so once the maps are enacted and you're commenting on them, whether you think they are good or bad for the state, commenting on current law is not lobbying. If in your state, your advocacy is to support or oppose a ballot measure, know that it is direct lobbying. And we have a number of resources to help your organization know along the continuum when your activity starts to count as lobbying and how to ensure that it does not align with any candidates that might also be working to support or oppose those ballot measures. Any questions on direct lobbying before we jump into grassroots lobbying?
Nothing specifically about that. I do have a question though that Jim brought up in the chat that is about tracking expenditures.
Yes.
So he's just confirming that expenditures that need to be tracked include the amount of salary paid to the staff who do the work. And then what are some other types of expenditures that must be tracked?
Good question. We have a resource that I'll make sure we send out tomorrow called Keeping Track. So not only does salary of staff time that lobby need to be counted, but it's all the compensation. So if staff are provided benefits, such as life insurance, health insurance, a portion of those benefits also need to be tracked. And we have a whole webinar on keeping track of your lobbying expenditures. It's probably outside the realm of this webinar, but we do have a number of more in-depth fact sheets. Also, on top of compensation, you want to keep track of a portion of the overhead. And so that is your organization's rent, utilities, so that would be internet, phone lines, administrative staff, a portion of those that are attributable to lobbying. And so I do have a slide here that has a sample timesheets. We have 3 different sample timesheets on our website that you can download and modify for both 501c3s and C4s. And so what we do in our organization, I'll show you here in just a minute. That's a good question. Basically, your staff tracks their time spent lobbying. Your accountant or your bookkeeper figures out the cost that is attributed, both compensation and overhead. And then your staff also needs to track their direct costs. So if they spend any money directly, like creating PowerPoint presentations, creating items to hand out or distribute, like flyers, those would be direct costs as well. And then your accountant would figure out a portion of the overhead. So let's move on to what amounts to grassroots lobbying. You'll see this definition here. The elements of grassroots lobbying are under the word grassroots, and a lot of the elements are the same. It's a communication to the general public. And the IRS says, let me run through the definition first. It's communication to the public that expresses a view about legislation and includes a call to action. So we haven't talked about general public yet. The IRS says the general public is anyone who is not an employee, a member, or a longtime volunteer of your organization. So if you are posting on social media, that is a communication to the general public. If you are hosting a webinar and you've invited members of the public or coalition members that have not paid dues, they're not members of your dues paying members of your organization, that's a communication to the public. So then you have to see whether the contents of your communication amount to expressing a view on legislation and include a call to action. The IRS says a call to action is any one of these 4 items on the right-hand side of the slide. So if your organization encourages people to call their legislators, provides an address or a contact information for them to call their legislators, provides a mechanism for them to call their legislators, or identifies legislators who are undecided or who are opposed to the legislation, then your electing public charity has engaged in grassroots lobbying. The really cool thing is you can engage in grassroots lobbying. You just need unrestricted funding and you need to track it. If you are up against your lobbying limit, you can leave off the call to action. Let's take a look at this tweet from the Legal Defense Fund. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund says, in case you missed it, Louisiana's redistricting session just closed. So legislative session just ended, and the Louisiana legislature passed multiple maps that violate the Voting Rights Act by failing to include a second majority Black district. It will now be the job of Louisiana governor to veto the maps. And then you look at the link because links count. So on your social media posts, all the links that you link to count. And so the links must be C3 permissible as well. And it says civil rights groups urge Louisiana governor to veto congressional maps. Do you think this is grassroots lobbying? They've tagged the Louisiana governor in it. It's a tweet to the public expressing a view about legislation. Is there a call to action?
Hi, Leslie. We have an answer here. Morgan says yes, because they mentioned the governor by name.
They mention the governor by name and they tag him, which anybody can then click on at Louisiana governor to find out how to contact him. So that provides a method for the public to contact the governor. Yep, that's your call to action right there, is tagging the governor. Yep, it's a grassroots lobbying, and they can do it. Yeah. And it's a really good example of grassroots lobbying around redistricting. Again, if you're up against your lobbying limit or your grassroots lobbying limit, or you don't have funding to engage in lobbying, and you are an electing public charity, you can leave off the call to action, and then it's not lobbying. One of the really cool ways, one of the second tips to maximize your advocacy is to work in coalition with other nonprofits, especially other nonprofits that have different networks from you and maybe even share different tax exempt statuses. So if you're a C3, look to work with a C4 or a C5. Remember, social welfare groups, advocacy organizations, or labor organizations. By doing that, it doesn't necessarily make your C3 a C4, because if you're working together, your joint activities still have to be C3 permissible, but it does give you access and maximizes all of your network, all of your powers and abilities. And so the C4 in your coalition can go off on their own and do additional C4 permissible activities. It just increases your strength, increases your advocacy capacity, increases your funding sources, access to funds, different sets of volunteers. We have a resource called the Coalition Checklist. In it, it has, we have sample, like a sample signing agreement, a sample agreement letter that helps coalitions, because there's a lot of different ways you can structure your coalition. You could have a C4 headed up. You could have each organization record their own lobbying that they do on behalf of the coalition. You could have coalition members pay in. They each pay in a certain percentage of money or volunteers or hours on lobbying. So there's a variety of ways you can structure your coalition, and it's best to have it documented in writing. It protects your 501c3 ability to continue to exist. There are a couple of lobbying exceptions I wanted to touch on, because these are really strategic. This is tip number 3. If you do not have money or don't have a lot of money to engage in lobbying, these lobbying exceptions can help expand your ability to advocate in an impactful way, because these activities do not count for lobbying for IRS and for grant purposes, for your private foundation and community grant purposes. So the first one is called Nonpartisan Analysis, Study, and Research. And the IRS says, if you engage in research that includes a full and fair discussion of the issues, and you broadly disseminate it to the public, which nowadays simply means putting it on the website, you can express a view on legislation. So you could create a map or feedback on a legislative map, and it does not amount to lobbying. This is a really powerful, impactful way for your community action agencies and your partners to engage in advocacy and comment on both state and congressional and municipal redistricting maps without engaging in lobbying. You can use your restricted funding for it. Here's just an example from the DC Justice Lab. It's kind of a continuation from this slide. The second example of an exception to lobbying for which you can use restricted grant funding is called technical assistance. And the IRS says that if your organization is invited in writing by a legislative body, not just one legislator, but by a legislative body, to provide information, and you make that information available to the whole legislative body, so the committee, the subcommittee, then you're providing that technical assistance does not amount to lobbying. So that could come in the form of testimony, that could come in the form of just written assistance. Sometimes Congress, they'll send out, like a congressional committee or subcommittee will send out a request, an RFI, request for information. Sometimes state legislative committees do that as well. And the third type of lobbying exception is what's called a broad discussion of social and economic problems. And you can convene a roundtable of community leaders, including legislators, very early in a discussion of a problem. And as long as you're not mentioning specific legislative proposals or legislative solutions, your discussion of the problem and looking at what other states have done does not amount to lobbying. Any questions? I know we are almost at our time.
Yeah, nothing in the chat at the moment. And
Okay.
yeah, we can go over a little bit, but we do just have like maybe like 5 or 10 minutes left.
Certainly. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
So how do you find the funding for your redistricting advocacy? We've talked about grant awards a good bit. So make sure when you do receive the grant agreements, you look in your grant agreements and determine whether that money can be used for lobbying or not. It always needs to be spent for the purpose that the funds were awarded for. Individual donations, if you have an event or you have a donate button on your organization's website, those individual donations can generally be used for lobbying. Know that if you send out a fundraising letter and you specifically say that we are raising money to work on legislative maps, and you make it very earmarked and very intentional that you're going to use the money just for lobbying and lobbying only, then the donations are not deductible for a charitable deduction. But there's a lot of redistricting activity that's not lobbying. So you could even make a fundraising letter that says we're going to work on fair maps for Pennsylvania, fair maps for Indiana. And that type of solicitation is not an earmarked solicitation. You can use our hotline. That's the kind of information we can help with. Corporate donations could be used for lobbying. Membership dues are a great source to fund your lobbying. Revenue as well, fee for services, fundraisers, ads, like if you have a newsletter or you're having an event and you want to have sponsors support your event, that type of ad revenue could be used for general operating purposes. Basically, anything that goes in the general operating budget could possibly be used for lobbying. However, wanted to highlight again, government grants cannot be used for lobbying. And the government's definition of lobbying is even a little bit broader than what we've been talking about today. So make sure if you receive a government grant or a government contract, you read their definition of lobbying. And you make sure to segregate those funds, make sure that you have separate funds for the lobbying and the redistricting lobbying that we've been talking about today. If you have questions, I've dropped the email address here where you can email us for help. Here's one sample timesheet. This is just one that we use, but it does show how we track our hours. We at Alliance for Justice, we are an electing public charity. So our staff keeps track of our time, both our lobbying and our non-lobbying time. And then at the end of each month, our accountant and our bookkeepers, they determine not only our compensation for lobbying, our overhead, and our direct expenses attributable to lobbying for the organization as a whole. Wanted to touch on real briefly, we've been talking about the IRS definition of lobbying, but there is, every state has a definition of lobbying for registration and reporting purposes. And this is what we call, if you've ever heard anyone say, I'm a registered lobbyist. So the IRS cares about limiting your organization's ability to engage in lobbying. They care about how much lobbying your organization, your charity is doing. The state doesn't care so much about how much lobbying you're doing. They want to know, for sunshine purposes, kind of for disclosure purposes, they want to know if your organization is involved in influencing both legislation and sometimes executive bodies, administrative bodies. And so you need to look at your state's lobbying definition for, and the lobbying threshold, whether you need to register as a lobbyist and report. Usually once you have to start registering, then comes along the reporting requirements. At Boulder Advocacy, we have a number of, we have about 35 different state lobbying registration guides that you can look at for free. And we can also help point you to the other states as well. A lot of states have a state lobbying guide. They're not specific to nonprofits, but we can help your organization kind of get pointed in the right direction, whether you need to register as a lobbyist or not. What we encourage groups to do is kind of create a spreadsheet with their primary activities, their advocacy activities on them, and then two columns, both a state lobbying column and an IRS lobbying column. And if you want, we can help you fill them in, whether or not those major activities are considered lobbying for state purposes and IRS purposes. That way, when your staff engages in those advocacy activities, they know how to track them on their timesheet. Just a word about using outside lobbyists. Even if your organization hires or pays for, or even has a pro bono outside lobbyist, it still may be that your organization, your nonprofit, needs to register as a state lobbyist. Every state's rules are different. And so just because you use an outside lobbyist, either a paid or a pro bono, a free volunteer outside lobbyist, your organization may still need to register as a lobbyist and file reports. Give us a call. We can help point you in the right direction. Also, don't assume, this is your third bullet point here, don't assume that your outside lobbyist knows the rules that apply for IRS purposes. Sometimes, apologize, I don't know if you see these calls coming in. I'm trying to silence them here. Don't assume that the outside lobbyist knows the rules that apply. Having a hard time sending these calls. Shoot. My apologies. We have worked with a couple different community agency activities, or community action agencies, and their lobbyist agreement to help their outside lobbyists itemize the IRS defined lobbying activities, because it's really important. You don't want to over-report the lobbying, especially if you don't have a lot of funding for that lobbying. Sometimes it's a decision, a strategic decision to go ahead and report those funds if you need to, or go ahead and report those activities. We have a number of resources that we will be sending out tomorrow. Links to all of these resources are available to download for free as well. We've got all of our contact information here on the very last slide. And with that, Ryan, I'll ask if we've got any questions. I can stay on for a few more minutes.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Leslie, for going through all of this really important information. I'm just going to try to real quick, like, get my video back up here. Sorry. There we go. So yeah, thank you so much. I know this is a lot of information, and I really appreciate you taking the time to step through it with everyone. I think one of the best, or one of the most important takeaways from just seeing all the information laid out in detail like this is just the amount of opportunity there is for nonprofits to engage in, general advocacy and some lobbying also, and especially in the realm of fair districting. So I think that those examples that you gave are really crucial, because I think it demonstrates how much how involved you can really be and still be well within not only the rules, but also your rights as a community organization. And again, we're obviously going to send out the slides. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to email myself or Leslie. Also, there's in the slides, there's also the information to contact Boulder Advocacy, as well as the hotline, which I would highly recommend, because I just think, especially with state lobbying rules, everyone's situation is going to be very different. All those situations are unique. Every community action agency is different. So if you have a specific question about something that's going on with your agency, or what you are or not allowed to do with specific funds, or how to track or monitor those actions and engagement opportunities, I would definitely recommend calling the hotline, because they'll be able to walk you through some of those difficult decisions. But with that, I'm just going to hand it over to you again, Leslie, for any sort of like final comments, and then we can get this up on the website so people can access it later on.
I think you summarized it really well, is that there's just a lot of opportunity to advocate. And if you're not sure where to start, give us a call.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Leslie. Everyone reach out if you have questions, please. And hopefully we'll get to partner with Boulder Advocacy again sometime in the near future. Thank you so much.
Love it. Thanks, Ryan. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.